Good evening and welcome to our weekly reflection, a time just to stop and think about other things or things that touch us in a way that adds value to our lives. Of course, it would seem like a natural opportunity to speak into what the state president has proclaimed with relation to all religious organizations and institutions being able to open places of worship. But there are people far better qualified at dealing with this, and in many ways we are people who are under authority, under episcopal authority, and so the bishop's words are really going to be the guideline for us as Anglicans under the authority, of course, and the ruling of the state. So that will no doubt be revealed in the next 24 to 36 hours, and we shall share that as soon as we're able to do so effectively and safely. So this evening what I'd like us to look at is two words that came to my attention recently, something that we don't often see together as a combination of words, and that is these two words: stubborn optimism. Stubborn optimism. There really is a sense, when we put those words together, of a bubbling under some kind of synchronicity, some power, perhaps. And the thought that crossed my mind is, would God consider fermenting something if there was a considerable or even a small significant portion of people that were an enclave of stubborn optimists? I have deep down within myself no doubt that that possibility exists, that God could do precisely this. Now, in some ways it feels odd and maybe uncomfortable to link that word stubbornness with optimism. Raise your hand if you, either in your own personal report or maybe you had a friend or a classmate, where in a school report at some point under the remarks there was this comment about being stubborn or willful or strong-willed. Usually that wasn't seen as a compliment at all, and an attitude that needed to be addressed and worked on. There is a negative in our perception around stubbornness, because it can be seen to be experienced as a form of pig-headedness, inflexibility, a certain blindness, and all of those aspects often, not always, but often prove detrimental to teamwork and can come from a place of being really opinionated in a way that closes off the heart rather than opening up the heart to all sorts of learning and other viewpoints, of listening to one another. It's not an attractive quality on the whole. So given those aspects, wouldn't it be better to talk in terms of something like tenacious optimism? Yes, one could possibly do that, but even within myself I find that doesn't sound quite as muscular and as obdurate as stubborn. So just for now, let's stick with the possibility of working with stubborn optimism. And just maybe there's a different lens through which we can view stubbornness. What if we linked it with active resistance, particularly active resistance to something bad or life-threatening? And when we couple this kind of active resistance with optimism, that's a pretty potent combination, don't you think? Now, optimism isn't about being an ostrich and hiding from reality, nor is it some form of happy-go-lucky attitude. The most basic components from what we can research on seems to have at its heart something about hopefulness and a confidence that is hopeful, and of course as people of faith that in some ways is slightly easier because we have the sense of a divine being who is at work to make all things well and good in time. So, stubborn optimism looks reality straight in the eye, no matter how painful or ugly, knows it for what it is, owns it, but is not owned by it, and always has an "yet" hovering in the wings, almost unwritten, but there. And the Psalms that we have in our scriptures are such terrific examples of that. I mean, this is a compilation, obviously, but we have this feeling that often the psalmist writes about things like, my enemies surround me on all sides and they want to destroy me. And then there's this movement in the psalm where it says, and yet God is my strength, and yet I will go to God as my refuge and my salvation. And that, in a way, is a form of stubborn optimism, isn't it? So despite any crisis, despite whatever's going on in our lives, despite no guarantees of a blissful or victorious outcome, stubborn optimism can be sustained through the Holy Spirit in attitude and action. It's a both and, because together in that sustenance of the divine, it becomes an infusion, not only into our lives, but into all life. And that infusion has almost as a byproduct loving regeneration. And that makes sense because God's creation and God's creativity and life force is always regenerating and always out of a space of love. If it's not a byproduct, then this isn't the kind of stubborn optimism that I'm talking about. So if we're coming into stubborn optimism with an expectation that we're going to slay the dragon, expect to see an end in sight that is good and powerful and whatever other positives we have around it, then again, it's not the kind of optimism I'm talking about. Another byproduct almost, despite ourselves, and it's really not about us working towards it, but another byproduct that seems to emerge out of stubborn optimism is a shift from merely a survival mentality to a force for life, a life force that has infinite juices that can regenerate on all sorts of levels. Now, this is a challenge. I'm not in any way saying it's easy, but it's a challenge that can work along with so many things that we discover and know more and more effectively through quantum physics. If we, as a group, as an enclave, as I mentioned earlier, come together as stubborn optimists in our attitude, in our thought processes, and it does take discipline in our actions, that all our actions are a life force that expresses stubborn optimism, and we are willing to let that be juices that God can ferment. Wow, this is potent. This is powerful. Don't you want to be part of that? I do. So even if we don't know if each of us individually take this on board, take it on board. And who knows who else is doing that, and another, and another. And then trust in the juicy work with the God fermenting juicily and regeneratively. Let's do it. It is there. It's available. And it is part of our powerfulness.